There was a place on the corner. Maybe yours had a red and white Rexall sign above the door. Maybe it was a thrifty with those low white shelves and the smell of something. Cherry syrup, maybe, or the warm metallic hum of the soda fountain behind the counter. Maybe yours was a family name nobody outside your neighborhood ever heard of. Kowalski's, Nakamura's, Garza's. A name your mother said the same way she said home. Whatever it was called, you knew it the moment you walked in. The floor, that specific linoleum, the kind that caught the light and held the cold no matter what season it was. The overhead fluorescents that buzzed just at the edge of hearing. The rotating wire rack near the door where the paperback novels spun slowly. Westerns, romances, mysteries, all of them exactly 25 cents. And behind the frosted glass partition at the back, the sound of the pharmacist counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. A deliberate, careful rhythm that meant somebody in your family was going to be okay. California had thousands of these places, from Eureka to San Diego, from the farm towns of the Central Valley to the beach blocks of Santa Monica, and every single one of them was something that no chain store, no big box pharmacy, no app on your phone has ever been able to replicate. Today, we're going back inside. To understand what the corner drugstore really was, you have to understand what California was in 1960. The state had just become the most populous in the nation. For the first time, more Americans lived in California than anywhere else. But this was not yet the California of freeways and sprawl and everything delivered to your door. This was still a California built to a human scale, a California where neighborhoods had centers, where streets had corners that mattered. The suburbs were young, the San Fernando Valley, the East Bay, the new tract spreading south from Los Angeles into Orange County. These neighborhoods were barely a decade old in 1960, and they were still figuring out what they were, what gave them identity, what made them feel like somewhere rather than just somewhere to sleep. The corner drugstore answered that question. It was not the grocery store, that was utilitarian, for the week's provisions. It was not the hardware store, that was your father's errand twice a year. The drugstore was something else. It was daily. It was casual. It was the place you could walk into with no reason and leave 15 minutes later feeling like you belonged to something. In 1960, California had approximately 4,200 independent drugstores operating across the state. That's not counting the chains. That's just the family-owned, single-location pharmacies. Most of them opened in the 1940s and 1950s, with men who had come back from the war and wanted something of their own. Many of them knew every family in the neighborhood by name. We'll come back to that. Walk in. That's where we're going to start. Not with the history, not with the dates, with the experience of walking through that door on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in 1963, when you were 9 years old and your mother sent you to pick up her prescription. The door. It was usually glass, heavy plate glass with a metal push bar, the kind that gave back your reflection when you approached it. In summer, you could feel the cold air from inside before you even touched the handle. That specific coolness, not harsh like a modern store, but a gentler version of it, like the building itself was asking you to slow down. Then the floor. California drugstores of the 1960s almost universally used the same linoleum, black and white geometric tile most often, sometimes a pale green, sometimes a warm cream. It was always clean in a way that felt deliberate. Someone had mopped it that morning, you could tell. And it had a sound, that specific hollow tap of shoes on linoleum that you heard nowhere else, not in a grocery store, not in a department store, here. The light was fluorescent, always, and it hummed.
Not loudly, just present, at the edge of perception, like the store was quietly breathing. The light made everything slightly cooler in color, slightly flatter, except where the warm, incandescent bulbs over the soda counter pushed through and turned everything amber. The soda fountain. Even before you saw it, you smelled it. That combination, cherry syrup from the fountain, the faint warm grease from the grill behind the counter, and underneath both of them, the faint antiseptic undertone that meant pharmacy. That specific three-part smell was the smell of this place. It was nowhere else. And if you grew up with it, you knew it the moment it hit you, even decades later. Even when you were 65 years old and walked past a display of old-fashioned cherry sodas at a specialty store somewhere, you knew it immediately. That's not coincidence. That's not sentimentality. That is how human memory works. Smell is processed in the same part of the brain that handles emotion. The researchers call it olfactory-evoked autobiographical memory. We just call it, yes, that, exactly that. The layout of the place was almost always the same. The pharmacist's counter at the back, always at the back, always elevated by a step or two so the pharmacist could see the whole store. Greeting cards and stationery on the left wall, the wire rack of paperbacks near the entrance, always spinning slightly from the door's draft. Cosmetics in glass cases, Revlon, Max Factor, Maybelline. The magazine section with Life, Look, TV Guide, and the comic book spinner. And near the front, beneath the glass of the main display case, a long row of candy in glass jars. Not bags, jars. Lidded glass jars, each filled with something different. Licorice, peppermints, those orange slices dusted in sugar, the wax bottles filled with colored syrup that made no nutritional sense whatsoever. You stood at that case for a long time before you decided. Before we get to what they sold and what they meant, there's a specific thing about the way these stores were designed that most people never consciously registered, and it tells you everything about what this place actually was. The pharmacist's counter was always at the back. Think about that for a moment. In every other retail establishment, the grocery store, the hardware store, the five and dime, the transaction happened at the front. You entered, you moved toward the merchandise, you paid near the exit, you left. The flow was efficient and directional, in and out. The drugstore reversed it. The prescription, the thing most people actually needed, was at the back, which meant that to get what you came for, you had to walk through the entire store, past the cosmetics, past the magazines, past the candy case, past the soda fountain, all the way to the back, and then wait. While you waited, and you always waited, because filling a prescription took 15 to 20 minutes, and that was considered fast, you sat at the counter, or you browsed the paperbacks, or your kids had an ice cream while you talked to whoever happened to be sitting next to you. The drugstore was engineered, whether intentionally or not, for accidental community. It was one of the few places in American life where people from different circumstances routinely sat next to each other and just waited. The counter was the great equalizer. At the soda fountain in a Burbank Rexall, or a Fresno Family Pharmacy, or an Owl Drug on Geary Street in San Francisco, you sat down, you ordered your cherry Coke or your coffee, and the person next to you was a neighbor you'd never introduced yourself to, a kid from 2 blocks over, someone's grandmother, the man who fixed your car. Nobody orchestrated this. There was no program, no community initiative. The architecture did it. The soda jerk behind the counter, that term, by the way, came from the jerking motion of pulling the handle on the fountain dispenser, knew everyone who sat there with any regularity. They knew who took their coffee black, who wanted extra cherry syrup, whose kid had just gotten braces and couldn't have the caramel. They remembered, because this was their corner of the world, and these were their people, and that was simply how it was done. This is what we mean when we say the corner drugstore was the center of the neighborhood. Not figuratively, architecturally, socially. It was designed by function, if not by blueprint, to hold people in place long enough for community to happen. And in 1960s California, with its new suburbs still struggling to feel like places rather than grids, that was not a small thing. That was everything.
There's one detail about thrifty drugstores that most people who grew up in California already know. But if you didn't grow up here, if you came to this story from somewhere else, it's going to surprise you. The ice cream cone cost a nickel, 5 cents, through most of the 1950s and all of the 1960s, when everything else was going up, when the cost of living was quietly inflating across the decade, when a glass of Coke at the counter had already climbed to a dime, Thrifty Drug held the ice cream cone at a nickel. Why? Because the Thrifty Corporation understood something that the chains who came after them forgot. The nickel ice cream cone was not a profit center. It was a marketing strategy. It was the reason a mother in Pasadena brought her children into the store instead of sending her husband alone. It was the reason kids in Glendale preferred Thrifty over the grocery store on the same block. It was the reason the store was full of people who had not necessarily intended to be there. And once they were there, they stayed. The soda jerks who served those cones, and the ice cream at Thrifty was served in a specific cylindrical scoop, the kind that left a perfect disc of ice cream, not a rounded ball. These young men and women were among the most visible public-facing workers in their communities. They were teenagers mostly, 17, 18 years old, often the first job. And the training was specific. You learned the menu completely. You addressed customers by name when you knew it. And you never rushed someone who was sitting. The counter was not a place for turnover. It was a place for people. In the independent drugstores, the family-owned pharmacies that weren't part of any chain, the soda counter was often run by a family member, a daughter on weekday afternoons, a son on Saturday mornings. These were not employees in the modern sense. They were extensions of the family's identity in the neighborhood. In the Fresno pharmacy owned by the Yamamoto family, the youngest daughter worked the counter every day after school from 1961 to 1968. She knew which of the regulars took their coffee at 4 o'clock. She knew which of the older men would sit for an hour with nothing but a glass of water and the newspaper because they were lonely and this was the warmest place they knew. She brought them refills without being asked. Nobody told her to do that. Nobody trained her. It was simply what you did when these people were your neighbors. Now, let's talk about what no chain has ever been able to replicate. Behind the frosted glass partition at the back of the store, past the elevated step, behind the counter with its amber bottles and its precise paper labels, was a person who knew things about your family that your neighbors didn't know, that your coworkers didn't know. In some cases, things that other members of your family didn't know. The pharmacist. In the 1960s, the neighborhood pharmacist was not what the pharmacist became. He, and in that era it was almost always a man, was not an intermediary between a prescription and a pill bottle. He was a medical advisor, a counselor, the person you called sometimes before you called the doctor, because the doctor cost money, because the doctor required an appointment, because the pharmacist was right there and he knew you. He knew that your mother was on digitalis for her heart and shouldn't be taking the cold medication she was about to ask for. He flagged that without being asked, without billing for the consultation. He simply said quietly across the counter, "Let me suggest something else for that." He knew that your son had been filling prescriptions for a condition the family didn't discuss publicly. He never mentioned it. He just made sure the bag was always ready and the conversation at the counter was about baseball. He knew the difference between the Garcias on Maple and the Garcias on Vine, and he knew that Mrs. Garcia on Maple was going through something difficult, and when she came in, he gave her the prescription and then asked how she was doing and meant it. This was the irreplaceable thing. Not the products, not the prices, not even the ice cream, though the ice cream mattered. It was the accumulated knowledge of a man who had watched a neighborhood grow up, who had dispensed medicine to the same families for 20 years, who understood in a practical and human way that health is not separate from life, it is embedded in it.
When the chains came, and we'll get to that, the first thing they couldn't replicate was this. Not because the corporate pharmacists were less capable, but because the relationship took years, and the chains moved people every 2 years, and the knowledge left with them.
Something happened in 1966 that most people never heard about. It wasn't a law, it wasn't a disaster, it was a meeting, a boardroom meeting at the Walgreen Company headquarters in Chicago, where a decision was made to accelerate the chain's expansion into California at a rate the state had never seen. Walgreens had been in California since the 1930s, but in 1966, the growth strategy changed. This is the moment historians of American retail mark as the beginning of the end for the independent California drugstore. It wasn't sudden. Nothing like this ever is. But the forces that had been gathering since the late 1950s, the suburban sprawl that required a car to reach any destination, the expansion of the shopping center model that pulled foot traffic off Main Street and into anchor store parking lots, the rise of discount merchandising that made the independent stores' pricing uncompetitive, all of these forces found their acceleration point in the mid-1960s. By 1968, 17 independent drugstores in the Los Angeles area alone had closed. By 1972, that number had risen to over 200 statewide. Not because they failed, exactly, because the world around them changed faster than any single-family business could adapt. The soda fountain went first. The chains did the math. The soda counter required full-time labor, specialized equipment maintenance, dedicated square footage, and a slow-pace hospitality model that was incompatible with the high-volume transaction model the chains were optimizing for. The Rexall Corporation phased out soda fountains across most of its California locations between 1964 and 1969. Thrifty held its lunch counters slightly longer, into the early 1970s in some locations, before the same economics prevailed. And with the soda fountain went the reason to linger. And with the reason to linger went the accidental community. And with the accidental community went, slowly, over the following 2 decades, the neighborhood itself. That is not an overstatement. Urban researchers who studied the dissolution of American neighborhood cohesion in the 1970s and 1980s found consistently that the loss of informal gathering spaces, drugstore counters, hardware store stoops, the barber shop, preceded the measurable decline in neighborhood social trust by roughly 5 to 8 years. The place went first, the community followed. Not all of them closed. In the small towns, the ones that didn't get the freeway exit, the ones the shopping centers passed by, some of the old pharmacies survived. In towns like Ferndale in Humboldt County, in Cambria on the Central Coast, in Banning in the pass between Los Angeles and Palm Springs, in parts of the Sacramento Valley where the strip mall economics simply never fully took hold. In these places, the pharmacist still knows your name, still flags the drug interactions, still asks about your daughter, still has the same linoleum floor and the same fluorescent hum, and, in a few very specific, very beautiful cases, still has a soda counter in the back. And Thrifty. Thrifty Drug became Thrifty Payless in the 1990s, and then was acquired by Rite Aid in 1996. The stores changed, the branding changed, the prices changed. But in hundreds of Rite Aid locations across California, the ones that started as Thrifty stores, the ice cream counter remained. Different price now, different world, but the same cylindrical scoop, the same flavors, many of them, the same idea, come in, stay a while. That is not nothing. That is actually something close to everything. There's a photograph in the Prelinger archives. No date on it, but from the clothing in the cars visible through the window, it's sometime around 1962, of the interior of a drugstore somewhere in California. In the foreground, a woman in her 40s is sitting at the soda fountain counter. She has a glass of something in front of her that she isn't drinking. She's turned slightly on the red vinyl stool, turned toward the person sitting next to her. They are talking. You can't tell about what. It doesn't matter.
Behind her, a boy of about 8 or 9 is standing at the paperback rack, turning it slowly, looking at the covers. He's not going to buy anything, he's just there, present, part of the place. The pharmacist is visible at the back, behind the frosted glass, moving with that careful, deliberate rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nobody in the photograph looks like they're in a hurry. That is the thing that cannot be rebuilt by any chain or any app or any delivery service that arrives in 40 minutes. Not the products, not the efficiency, the unhurriedness, the willingness to be in a place with other people for no particular reason for 15 minutes in the middle of a Tuesday. You know this place. You've been in this photograph. If you grew up in California in the 1960s, or if you just know someone who did, or you feel it from the stories, we want to hear from you. Tell us the city. Tell us the store. Tell us the thing you always ordered. The comments section is yours. And if this took you somewhere you needed to go today, there's more where this came from. Next time, we're going to another place that California kept for a while and then quietly let go. Another corner, another sign, another world worth remembering. We'll see you there.